Imagine spending 7 years earning an advanced degree. Late nights, exams, certifications, all leading to that moment where you finally arrive. Stable job, respected title, a clear place in the social hierarchy. You did everything right. And for a while it works. The salary comes in, the lifestyle follows, and there's this quiet assumption that things will keep moving upward. Then something shifts. Not overnight, not with a dramatic headline, but fast enough that you feel it. The currency weakens. Companies start cutting back. Projects disappear. And suddenly, the role that once felt essential becomes optional. You're still the same person, same knowledge, same credentials, but no one is paying for it anymore. Now contrast that with someone else. A plumber, maybe a mechanic, someone who never spent years inside a lecture hall, never collected degrees or titles. A year ago, they were just doing okay. Nothing impressive, nothing elite. But now, they're booked out for weeks, cash in hand, raising prices, and people still pay. Because pipes still burst, engines still fail, life still breaks in very physical ways. Pause for a second, because this is where the illusion cracks. One person did everything society told them would guarantee stability, and lost it. The other built something far less prestigious, and became indispensable. Same world, same moment, completely different outcomes. So the question isn't who worked harder. It's this: what actually holds value when the system that defines value starts to shake? To understand why that reversal happens, you have to look at where value actually comes from. Not the surface-level explanation, but the underlying structure. Most white-collar careers are built on something invisible. Institutions, corporations, universities, financial systems, regulatory bodies. Entire layers of organized trust that give your role meaning and, more importantly, pay for it. On paper, it looks like your degree or your skill set is what creates your income. But in reality, those things only have value because a much larger system is functioning smoothly in the background. Think about it for a second. A corporate strategist, a financial analyst, a middle manager. These roles don't exist in isolation. They exist because companies are growing, capital is flowing, and markets are stable enough to justify long-term planning. The moment that stability weakens, the demand for those roles doesn't just shrink, it can disappear entirely. And this is where things get uncomfortable, because it means your value isn't fully yours. It's partially borrowed. Borrowed from the institution that employs you. Borrowed from the economic conditions that make your role necessary. Borrowed from a system that, most of the time, feels permanent, but isn't. When everything is working, this dependency is invisible. In fact, it feels like the opposite. It feels like security, prestige, progress. But remove the institutional support, and something strange happens. The credential stays, but the value evaporates. A degree doesn't fix a broken pipe. It doesn't grow food. It doesn't repair a vehicle or restore electricity. Those are direct, tangible outputs, skills that operate independently of whether a corporation is hiring or a market is expanding. And that's the key distinction. Some forms of human capital are system-dependent. Others are system-independent. System-dependent skills require layers of coordination, funding, and trust to function. System-independent skills operate closer to immediate human needs. They don't rely on a functioning stock market. They don't require a stable currency. They solve problems that exist regardless of economic conditions. Now, this doesn't mean one is better than the other in normal times. In a stable, growing economy, system-dependent roles can be incredibly valuable. That's why they often dominate the top of the income ladder. But their strength is also their weakness. Because the more layers required to sustain your role, the more fragile it becomes when those layers start to crack. And here's the part most people overlook. We've been trained to measure value based on how the system rewards us today, not how resilient that value is if the system changes tomorrow. So we optimize for credentials, for titles, for signals that only make sense inside a fully functioning structure, without asking a much simpler question. If the structure weakens, even slightly, does what I do still matter? History has a very clear answer to that, and it's not always what people expect. If this idea feels theoretical, history has a way of making it very concrete. Because we've seen this pattern play out before. Not once, not twice, but across completely different countries, cultures, and time periods. And every time, the outcome follows a strangely similar script. Start with a simple observation. When a system breaks down, whether through economic collapse, hyperinflation, or political instability, value doesn't disappear. It rearranges. Take the example of Weimar hyperinflation. On paper, Germany still had its universities, its professionals, its educated class. Professors, lawyers, administrators, they didn't suddenly lose their knowledge. Their credentials didn't vanish. But the currency did. And with it, the institutions that funded and sustained those roles began to crumble. Salaries became meaningless almost overnight. People were getting paid, technically, but that money couldn't buy anything by the time they spent it. So what happened? Those same highly educated individuals were forced into completely different kinds of work. Manual labor, bartering, anything that could produce immediate, tangible value. Meanwhile, farmers, people who could grow food, were suddenly in a position of power. Mechanics who could fix machinery, craftsmen who could produce goods locally. Because in a collapsing system, value compresses toward necessity. Food, shelter, repair, energy. Things that solve immediate problems, not abstract ones. Now move forward a few decades to another example, collapse of the Soviet Union. Again, you had a massive institutional breakdown. Entire industries vanished. Government funding evaporated. Professional roles that once carried status and stability, engineers, academics, bureaucrats, found themselves in a completely different reality. Some adapted. Many struggled. There are documented cases of highly trained scientists driving taxis. University professors selling goods in street markets. Not because they lacked intelligence or discipline, but because the system that valued their expertise no longer functioned. At the same time, people with practical, hands-on skills found ways to navigate the chaos more effectively. Mechanics could repair aging vehicles in a system where replacements were scarce. Small-scale farmers could produce food in a supply chain that was breaking apart. Again, the same pattern. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. This dynamic isn't limited to extreme, headline-level collapses. You can see smaller versions of it in localized crises, economic downturns, regional instability, even natural disasters. Whenever systems are disrupted, even temporarily, the hierarchy shifts. The further your skill is from immediate physical usefulness, the more vulnerable it becomes. And the closer it is to solving real-world, tangible problems, the more durable it is. This creates a kind of hidden hierarchy of value. At the top, during stable times, are highly specialized, abstract roles: finance, consulting, strategy, administration. These are leveraged on top of a functioning system, and they benefit from scale. That's why they pay so well. But during instability, that hierarchy inverts. Suddenly, the most valuable skills are the ones that operate without abstraction. The ones that don't require layers of coordination to be useful. Fixing, building, growing, maintaining. Things that sound simple, but become critical when everything else becomes uncertain. And here's the uncomfortable part. In every one of these historical cases, the people at the top of the old system didn't see the shift coming in time. Not because they were careless, but because the system had trained them to believe their value was permanent, that their credentials were enough, that demand for what they did would always exist. But demand isn't permanent. It's conditional. And when the conditions change, even slightly, the market for certain types of human capital can collapse much faster than people expect. Which brings us to today, because you don't need a total societal breakdown to see this process begin. Sometimes all it takes is a shift in what the system actually needs. Now here's where this stops feeling like history and starts feeling uncomfortably current. Because today, you don't need a currency collapse or a geopolitical breakdown to trigger this shift. You just need a change in demand, specifically what the system actually needs from human labor. And that change is already happening. Quietly. Look at the rise of automation and artificial intelligence. Not in a futuristic sci-fi sense, but in a very practical day-to-day way. Tasks that once required teams of analysts, coordinators, or specialists are now being compressed into software. What used to take hours now takes minutes. And when that happens, something subtle but powerful occurs. The institution doesn't disappear, but its need for people shrinks. Companies start asking a different question. Not how many people do we need, but how few can we operate with? And once that question becomes central, entire layers of white-collar roles become vulnerable. Not because they weren't valuable before, but because their value was tied to a level of complexity the system no longer requires. Think about that for a second. Your degree didn't change. Your experience didn't disappear. But the demand for that exact combination of skills? It can drop fast. This is what a localized collapse looks like. Not the entire system failing at once. Just specific segments losing relevance. And when that happens, the effect is similar to what we saw in history, just more contained, more selective. One department gets cut, then another. Hiring freezes start. Projects get canceled. Roles that once felt secure suddenly become redundant. That word, redundant, is doing a lot of work here. It doesn't mean useless in an absolute sense. It means unnecessary within the current system configuration. And that configuration is changing faster than most people realize. Now compare that to hands-on, practical work. A plumber isn't competing with an algorithm when a pipe bursts. A mechanic isn't being replaced by software when an engine fails in the real world. These problems are physical, immediate. They exist regardless of how advanced the digital layer becomes. So while certain white-collar functions are being compressed or eliminated, these roles remain anchored. Stable not because they're prestigious, but because they're necessary. And this creates a strange divergence. On one side, you have highly educated individuals facing increasing competition, downward pressure on wages, and growing uncertainty. On the other, you have tradespeople experiencing steady, or even rising, demand. Not universally, of course, but enough to notice a pattern. And here's the key insight. This shift doesn't require a crisis. It can happen during growth, during stability, even during periods that, on the surface, look economically healthy. Because it's not driven by collapse. It's driven by efficiency. The system is optimizing itself, reducing redundancy, streamlining processes, and in doing so, it's quietly redefining what kinds of human capital it actually values. Which brings us back to that earlier idea, borrowed value. If your role depends on a structure that is constantly optimizing, then your position within that structure is never fully secure. Not in the way it feels. Because the system isn't designed to preserve roles. It's designed to minimize cost and maximize output. And anything that stands in the way of that eventually gets replaced, reduced, or removed. So the real risk today isn't just economic collapse. It's gradual irrelevance. The kind that doesn't happen all at once. The kind where, year by year, your skill set becomes a little less essential, until one day, the system moves on without you. And if that's the direction things are moving in, then the question becomes less about predicting the future, and more about positioning yourself for a range of possible outcomes. Which means understanding one thing clearly. Not all skills degrade at the same rate. Once you start looking at skills through this lens, a pattern begins to emerge. Not all forms of human capital are equal, not in terms of status, not in terms of income, but in terms of resilience. Because when systems come under pressure, value doesn't disappear randomly. It compresses toward what is essential. You can think of it as a hierarchy. At the base, the most durable layer, you have survival-critical skills. These are the things that remain valuable in almost any environment. Growing food, accessing and managing water, basic repair. If something breaks, someone has to fix it. If people need to eat, someone has to produce that food. These skills don't depend on economic cycles. They operate at a level below the system. Above that, you have infrastructure skills. Mechanics, construction, electrical work. These are the people who keep physical systems running. Roads, buildings, machines, energy. Even in unstable conditions, these functions remain necessary. In many cases, they become even more valuable because maintaining existing systems becomes more important than expanding new ones. Then at the top, you have specialized system-dependent roles. Corporate strategy, administration, layers of management, certain types of analysis. These can be incredibly valuable, but only when the system is stable enough to support them. They rely on surplus, on growth, on a level of coordination that doesn't always hold under pressure. And this is where the inversion happens. In good times, the top of the hierarchy earns the most. It carries prestige, influence, and social validation. But in stressed environments, that same layer becomes the most fragile, because it's the furthest removed from immediate necessity, while the bottom layer, often overlooked, sometimes undervalued, becomes the most stable. This doesn't mean everyone should abandon what they're doing and move into manual labor. That's not the point. The point is understanding where your skills sit in this hierarchy. Because most people have been trained to optimize for the top, status, credentials, specialization, without ever considering what happens if the conditions supporting that layer begin to weaken. And once you see that, you start to think differently. Not just about income, but about durability. Because in the end, the most valuable skill isn't the one that pays the most today. It's the one that still matters when everything else starts to shift. So where does this leave you? Not in a position to panic. And not in a position to abandon everything you've built. That's not realistic, and it's not necessary. This is about adding a layer, not replacing one. Because the real takeaway here isn't that white-collar skills are useless. It's that they're incomplete on their own. They work incredibly well inside a stable system, but they don't give you much protection outside of it. So the goal is simple: diversify your human capital. Start small. Pick one practical, non-digital skill. Something physical. Something tangible. It doesn't need to be impressive. Basic plumbing. Simple electrical work. Growing a small amount of food. Repairing everyday items. The kind of things people always need, regardless of what the economy is doing. And here's the key: don't approach it like a career shift. Approach it like building optionality. Spend a few hours on the weekend. Learn the basics. Make mistakes. Get familiar with solving problems in the real world, not just inside a screen or a system. Over time, that competence compounds in a very different way. Not through promotions or titles, but through independence. Because something changes when you know you can fix, build, or produce something yourself. The system still matters, but you're not entirely dependent on it anymore. And that shift is subtle but powerful. It gives you flexibility. It gives you resilience. And most importantly, it gives you a backup layer of value that doesn't need validation from an institution to exist. So if the system keeps running, you're fine. But if it starts to shift, even slightly, you're not starting from zero. You're already anchored to something real. And in a world where value can change faster than people expect, that might matter more than any credential you hold.